D23 came with a surprise twist, at least for me. And the surprise wasn't the countless new sequels and spin-offs unveiled, nor the streamlined cash grabs Disney seems to be keen on shipping as content. The astonishment came from announcement of Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man. It was perhaps the animated series I'd been keenly awaiting for the past 3 years, possibly because I was hoping we'd get a worthy entry in the Spider-Man animation anthology that has been suffering for the past decade. And its initial promise of an art style straight out of the comic books made it all much more promising. But then I saw the first clip. This series was going to be 3D animation. It is an understatement to say I was disappointed. But I thought I was the only one until I saw a thread of comments and quotes on Twitter sharing the same thought. Why would they change such a promising art style to 3D animation? But then I calmed down again after a few moments, realizing my hope was already too far-fetched. Hollywood killed 2D animation a long time ago. That moment took me back to the sense of bewilderment I felt a few weeks ago. I was at my uncle's, and my cousins are at a really young age, so they'd normally be watching the kids' channels. And at one point in the afternoon, Onycs Jr. was on, and there was, to my shock, a 3D animated reboot of Dora the Explorer. And although I was shocked to see the 2D Dora grace this new realm, it wasn't an exclusive take. Rugrats also got the same treatment a few years ago. Classics which forged the legacy of Nickelodeon, stripped of life in this CGI dystopia. Usually this wouldn't come as a surprise, but it represented a pattern I couldn't help but be intrigued by. The majority of animation shows being produced are 3D. The Smurfs, Miraculous Ladybug, Paw Patrol, Shimmer and Shine, Blaze and the Monster Machines, and hundreds of others. And that in by itself is not an issue, but they are part of a long-running story in animation from the past decades. The rise of 3D animation has been dominant in the series industry since the early 2010s, but the truth is, it was destined to take over with Hollywood's penchant for the next cash cow, since Pixar invented the industry in 1995 with Toy Story. DreamWorks followed suit 3 years later with Ants, and then Blue Sky, Illumination, and numerous others graced the scene too. Disney, the king of 2D animation as well, joined in. And that wasn't a bad thing necessarily, wanting the new shiny tech is a common theme in any industry. But for the West, this wasn't merely treated as a gold rush, where the CGI market booms, then stabilizes, and companies return to the 2D world. It was rather viewed as the replacement of 2D. Since the early 2000s, the 2D medium has died year by year at the box office, to the point where it's now merely a niche market for anime spin-off movies and disposable films. But the movie market shift was merely the beginning of the end. Even lesser-funded animation TV shows started to join the trend after the 2010s. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Kung Fu Panda shows were one of the first to adopt it into a series format from major IPs. The West saw 3D as a successor for what would be an outdated 2D art. The migration only accelerated in the following years, with LEGO Animation starting to control a major stake in the industry. But the major problem is, the 3D shows themselves are being prioritized due to their cheap production costs, rather than as expressive artistic mediums. They're being mass-produced and distributed as their relative cost is lesser than 2D animation. And this is where their art quality and narration suffers in the aftermath. These shows don't even have good 3D animation. Even looking into the Dora reboot, you can see the stiff movements, bare backgrounds, and almost lifeless characters in every frame. Most of these are not good productions at all, the reason being their cheap production. Now, I want to clarify, this isn't a critique of the shows, but of their animation. Although the guilt isn't completely on the companies. Audiences share responsibility too, including myself. I remember preferring these new 3D animation shows over the old 2D cartoons back in the day, simply because they were the new thing and their animation seemed really cool. And like me, lots of folks flocked to the 3D hype train. But in my case, it was merely a phase before realizing the true value of animation. As you grow up, you finally start to get perspective. The perfect example, I'd say, is the plot of Toy Story. Buzz was my favorite when I watched it as a little kid. Just like Andy preferred them initially. The reasoning is simple. Buzz was the new cool astronaut. He was a space ranger with all the cool gadgets and wings. He represented the staple of the modern era. But Woody, on the other hand, was an old toy with absolutely nothing to offer except a repetitive voice box.
All I can do is...
There's a snake in my boots.
But immediately as I started to grow a little older, I began to love Woody more. Not only because of his character, but because he represents real value. He's not a cheap and mass-produced product like Buzz, but a relic of a bygone era where love, care, and craftsmanship went to every toy, and a symbol of the beautiful cowboy era. The same way, my perspective on 2D animation drastically shifted the more I grew up. It was an art form which had an unparalleled level of storytelling and charm 3D animation can never capture. The inverse is also true. CGI offers a medium to tell stories in ways 2D animation cannot. But Western animation never established the balance, and it never seemed like they wanted to. The view of 2D animation was of an outdated art, only preserved for cheap TV shows and indie movies. And it's especially disappointing in Disney's case as it's the medium that forged their entire legacy. There is no issue with fancying new technology and producing two styles at once, but Disney has not only abandoned 2D animation, it has grown a disdain for it. All their new original works are either 3D animated or CGI live actions. They haven't produced a single 2D animated feature in 13 years, and since have closed down their hand-drawing division entirely. But mind you, I haven't been advocating for traditional 2D drawings at all, but 2D animation, be it hand-drawn or computer-generated in general. And the most devastating revelation is that Hollywood was at the dawn of a new golden age with 2D animation. In the early 2000s, as 3D was at the center of persuasion, the 2D world was making gems and stories which have an unparalleled legacy. Atlantis: The Lost Empire, The Iron Giant, The Prince of Egypt, Treasure Planet, The Emperor's New Groove, The Road to El Dorado. Spirit, Lilo and Stitch were films released in what could have been a new era. Unprecedented creative works were on the rise, but their financial successes weren't as enormous as the new CGI movies, nor their budgets for that matter. But at the sight of mild turbulence, Hollywood completely abandoned what could have been a cultural defining moment. But that sliding doors era was utilized by the East. Identically to the Western world, the Japanese had also made their stamp through traditional hand-drawn animation. Their movies and shows provided a different structure and narrative to the status quo, but they were always second fiddle when up against the West. But at the dawn of CGI in the early 2000s, the Japanese didn't abandon ship. They rather doubled down on 2D animation, in what should have been the dusk ushered instead the golden era of anime. But do not be mistaken, the Japanese did in fact try to compete in the 3D market, but the gap in skill and technology, when compared to leading studios in the West, reminded them to remain in what they do best. CGI anime still exists to this day, though it never became the status quo. But this is not to say anime wouldn't have taken off had the West kept their grip on the 2D market. Anime shows were already on cable channels even in the 1990s, and the genre's place was already in good position. But the abandonment of 2D animation completely yielded the market for Japan towards establishing the art style as undisputably and uniquely of the anime genre. It became a cultural turning point for Japan. They are now synonymously known for their 2D animation movies and shows. But please, I want you to understand, this isn't a complaint saying Hollywood has completely abandoned 2D animation. Gems have been produced, although very rarely, even from Disney. Gravity Falls comes to mind, Infinite Train as well, We Bare Bears and other amazing shows too. But these are anomalies in an otherwise adult-oriented market. The 2D art style is continually being reserved for adult animation or niche shows with low promise. BoJack Horseman, Rick and Morty, Inside Job, and South Park are on this trend to name a few, while Invincible was a low-risk niche project that turned into mainstream success. The actual mainstream market is still at its lowest. And again, make no mistake, this isn't a childhood nostalgic rant. I myself am from a generation where CGI was already nearing its peak, and even in the early days, shows like Jimmy Neutron had always appealed to me and many others, both for their story and animation. This isn't a hate, rather a call to say 3D animation isn't the only medium. And more specifically, 3D animation can be the standard, but not the norm. Not all mainstream shows and movies should be 3D. Cause even the market had grown stale and saturated until Into the Spider-Verse revolutionized the industry. It's after that we saw the rise of 2D and 3D blend in Hollywood, with Intergalactic, Puss in Boots, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles bringing in a new creative art style. There will always be a place for creative and ambitious storytellers like The Amazing World of Gumball, in whichever art form they pursue. Iron Giant had mixed 3D animation with 2D art style as well, and many others will follow too. But mainstream Hollywood needs to wake up and see the potential 2D animation still has to offer. Going back to Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man, it was really disheartening to see Disney intentionally avoiding 2D projects. The developed concept art was perfect and unique for a comic book style animation, but instead they chose the video game route of 3D animation. I'm a big fan of the cartoony and vibrant styles of Hi-Fi Rush and Borderlands. It had worked for Slugterra and even a Marvelous What If too, but the fact that Disney chose the 3D art style over the retro comic book one from the concept art will never sit well with me. Maybe with the benefit of hindsight, I could be wrong, but currently, it's bound to go down as one of the most disappointing wasted potentials in recent memory. As good as 3D animation is, it should never be the norm.